My job is to tell you all the mundane things about planning. Now I'll try to keep it interesting. Deb did say try to keep it to 20 minutes because I like to talk, and so I'll try to keep it on point. A bit about myself. I did work at Yarra Ranges Council with Marcella for 17 years. I now run my own consultancy called Journeyman Planning. I'm working with a couple of our participants here, Sarah and Ben, as well as Fred and Catherine, already been to their sites and starting the process with them. So I'm well familiar with planning in the hills. I call myself a hillbilly. I live in the hills, Selby, not as quite as hilly as you guys, but we're still in the hills. And I thought it was quite interesting that Rob referred to the flats, because I think all of us identify hills versus flats, and there's a difference to down there to up here. And why is exactly why we live up here, because of that environment. So I've been in Selby for 11 years, and I've shared with a few people today that I was very fortunate not to be affected by the storm at all. I was fully prepared for it, ready, had the generator going, nothing happened. And then woke up in the morning and saw all the trauma and drama that affected all of you. So I count myself very lucky. So what Marcella and Deb had asked me to do today is to not give you everything about planning, because I've been working in planning for 25 years and I'm still learning about the intricacies of it. But to give you, a bit of a run through of some things to consider and some pointers about, how to get through this and your journey. And part of that engagement is the council has funding to engage experienced planners like myself and Manjusha, who I think is also working with a few of the other parties, in helping you guide and navigate that process, in using our experience and understanding of the planning controls, what you guys want to achieve, and how do we get you to the gate, being the planning permit, with everything ready to go. So, what is planning? I guess no doubt all of you have got a family friend or a relative or someone that you know that has lodged a planning permit, and you've heard the stories about the trauma of how long that takes and the hassles of council and the complications of it. And listen, some of those stories may be true. My experience at Yarra Ranges is not. The culture at Yarra Ranges was always about trying to facilitate an outcome and get people through it. A planning permit is a bit of a misnomer in some sense, because when we think about a planning permit, we think about a car parking permit, something that you obtain, you lodge your fee and you get it, and it's granted. A planning permit really is a process of assessment, and sometimes that's a fairly detailed assessment, and it's a journey of assessment as you go through that process. And the main purpose of it is really assess whether you're meeting the planning scheme's requirements. Now, that comes to the next question, or what is a planning scheme, or what's it trying to achieve, and what does it mean for you when you're preparing your application? A planning scheme is a very big document. Fortunately, I don't think they print them anymore. I can remember the days when they used to print them, and they were this thick and they take a long time and reams of paper to do. It's all online. But basically, that's a document prepared by the councillors, by the council, professional officers in the community, and it's really an embodiment of the expression of what the community wants to achieve for its area. How do we manage growth? What is it we want to preserve? What are the things that we have to consider about keeping our areas that are special to us still special? And when you lodge a planning permit, that is the mechanism the council uses to try to ensure that what development occurs in the area meets what that planning scheme is seeking to achieve, and gets the balance right between preserving all the different aspects. Now, the scheme can be complicated, and it's important to point out that there's provisions in the scheme that say do this. There's other provisions that say don't do that, and they seem like they are directly in conflict with each other. And I guess the point I'm making and pointing that out is that understanding what the scheme seeks to achieve and that balancing does require some experience and skill, and understanding what the plan is to achieve and how do you take apples, oranges and balance them to get pears. And the key point is that you guys are not expected to be the experts. You don't have to print out the whole planning scheme, all the planning controls for your site, and understand the infinite detail and the technicalities and the balancing and the policy and the information requirements. Your application does need to address them, but don't take upon yourselves that burden of trying to understand all of it, because as we saw from Rob and his presentation, there's a lot of things for you to consider. And from my experience, where I've seen people try to handle it all themselves, it often just causes more frustration and difficulty. And that's exactly why councils engage planning consultants, and there is people out there to assist you, like me, to explain it to you in simple terms, try to synthesise what you want to achieve and meet those scheme requirements. So, as I said, the scheme often tries to balance very competing requirements. One very clear example that you're probably all familiar with is bushfire. So we know that Mount Dandenong and the surrounding hills and the Yarra Valley is very much prone to bushfire risks. And that's because we live amongst the trees and vegetation that we value so much. And we know that with improved fire science, how you manage bushfire risk is you look at where your property sits, the vegetation around it, the topography, and also your house and how it's built. The scheme in one sense says take down the trees, because trees are fuel, fuel is an intense fire, and that equals risk for your house. But to balance preservation of what is key to this area, which is the environment and the landscape, there's parts of the scheme that says don't take down trees and vegetation, because that is part of what we want to preserve. So in that is the balancing of how do you meet sensible, logical fire safety provisions, but keep the natural values and environmental values of your area, your property, that are very important. So there's a fair bit of a push and pull in planning, in trying to work out what is an appropriate response and how do you balance that. And there's people to help you with that. Now, I mentioned before that there's probably good reasons why all of you have chosen to live in the hills. We've got a superior amenity, we've generally got very good access to most things. It's a fabulous place to live in, and we make the choice to live up here in acknowledgement of the risks of bushfire and so forth because of that environment. And the planning scheme and why a planning permit is required to rebuild is because the scheme tries to preserve that landscape, preserve the amenity that we all enjoy, and importantly preserve some of the environmental aspects of our trees and bush and so on. And I was mentioning to a few people during lunch around, have you ever seen old photos of Mount Dandenong during the 1930s? Bald hills, agricultural land. The landscape has changed a lot, and what we see now is probably more going back to a natural presentation of what the hill is. But the planning for that, as to why you need a planning permit and the controls that are in place, and I'm leading to an explanation as to why certain controls are in place. The planning recognised that to preserve some of those values, there needed to be an evolution of the controls. A lot of these areas were developed and subdivided years ago without planning controls, and there was a very demonstrable impact on the environment. The trees were gone, there was landslip issues, creeks and waterways were getting contaminated because of septics and waste management and so forth. So the origins of a lot of these controls are trying to prevent those issues and deal with the landslip. And Darren will probably have to point out, that there has been severe landslips on Mount Dandenong because of tree clearing and the natural risk areas. There has been a lot of tree removal, and our creeks and waterways have suffered because of septic containment and the number of people that live up on the hills. So planning's evolved to try to deal with that, and that's often why there is a number of controls in place you will need to address as part of your planning applications. So I won't go into in particular issues of vegetation and landscape issues, risk, because I understand there's a bit of a session where there'll be an opportunity to go through that. But I'll give you a bit of an overview of some of the planning controls that you experience on your site. Now, some of you may be familiar with this because you're into the process, you've already investigated, and I won't go into the infinite detail, but more to give you an understanding of, well, what does a zone mean, what does an overlay mean, what is it going to mean for your application and your design. So that creative process that Kim was explaining, she was explaining that it's impacted by landscape, it's impacted by bushfire, and these are the controls that sort of mean that you need to look at it. So what is a zone? A zone is basically, I mean, you're all familiar with the term of the zone. We have industrial zones, residential zones. Most of your properties will be in a green wedge A zone, which is a zone used extensively on Mount Dandenong, which is a rural living zone. It recognises that you live in a rural area, but you're more of a, still a residential sort of suburban character because of you're living relatively close to some of your neighbours. That varies. Some of you have bigger properties, some of you have smaller properties. And the zones basically say what you can and can't do on your property, what you can use it for, i.e. you can't set up a big works, you can't, but you can build a house. And it controls how you use your land, and importantly whether you need a planning permit to build a house, which you do. Now we also have overlays. Now overlays do exactly as they say, they overlay your land and they tell you about the physicality of your property. So they describe issues of bushfire, flooding, vegetation, landscape, all of the things that we want to preserve or we need to manage as part of the development of an area. So they will often have very specific requirements around a certain nature of the physical aspect of your site that you would have to consider. The key ones that, and keep in mind each of your properties sits in a different context, different orientation, different size, and you may have slightly different overlays to even someone just next door, based on where you sit and so on. But probably the key ones that you're going to encounter are a bushfire management overlay, and planners love their acronyms, so BMO is, if you hear someone say that, that's bushfire management overlay. EMO, that's the erosion management overlay. Darren will speak a bit more to that about the technicalities of it. Significant landscape overlay, and some of you might even have a environmental significance overlay. Now, I'll briefly take you through what those mean, and most of them you've probably worked out generally what they're seeking to do. BMO means you're in a high risk bushfire area, which is, we all know. And what it means for your application is your house has to be built to a certain BAL rating, Bushfire Attack Level rating, and there must be an assessment of your house, where it sits on the site, the topography of the area, and more importantly, how it sits in relation to vegetation on adjoining properties and in the landscape. Because all that goes to establishing what is your bushfire risk and what level your house needs to be built to accommodate or be safe. Well, I won't use the term safe, to manage the risk as best it can in the event of a bushfire. The erosion management overlay is about landslip. So there's been probably 40 years plus of assessment of landslip risk across Mount Dandenong, and there has been some large landslips. The planners often, I don't know if they still do it, but Darren takes the planners on an extensive trip around the Shire and actually points out to where there have been previous landslips. So landslips are a risk, and that's probably because of the geology, the steepness of the site, past vegetation removal, and perhaps poor drainage. These are the sort of factors that can lead to landslip. And most of the properties on the hill, unless you're on the very top of the ridge, where it's nice and flat, will have some impacts in terms of landslip. What that means for your application is that you'll need to have an engineer assess the base, qualities of your site, the existing cut and fill, the soil type, to work out whether you're at an elevated risk or a moderate risk of landslip. But that assessment also needs to look specifically at the development that you're proposing. And I'll give you some tips and hints about that later, but the general rule is avoid big cuts and big fills. Now some properties, I think Kim showed that one where she, the extensive cut, that's probably an example of what you don't do. But historically, some properties, and some of your properties, may have large cuts already. That was what you did in the 70s. cut it and you put a house on it, and because landscape issues weren't controlled or regulated. So some sites will have some issues, but generally you want to minimise your disturbance to your site and how much retaining and cut and fill you want to do. Significant landscape overlay. This is one that will trigger a planning permit for trees, and it's mainly aimed at trying to preserve that overall ridgeline character that Mount Dandenong has. When we look up from Melbourne, nearly anywhere, you can see Mount Dandenong and the trees and the coverage. So these controls is aimed at trying to preserve as much of that coverage and that landscape value, and ensure that buildings sit comfortably within that landscape. So you will have a permit required for tree removal, but also for works. How that will implicate things is if you do have vegetation removal or you want to remove additional trees, there'll be a need to assess that and have an agricultural report looking at the trees and the issues. Now, some may also have a ESO, which is more recognition, and I know Sarah's property and Ben's property has an ESO on it. But I visited the site and they don't actually have too much left on it, but their property has an ESO because they're not far from the key areas of the national park that do have some environmental values, habitat values and native values that are to be preserved. So now some of your sites might have more specific overlays that will need to be looked at, but what I'd be suggesting is that that can be dealt with by having individual discussions with the council officers. Now, under most of these provisions, without boring you, you will require a permit, and what that means is that they are considerations for council and they will be points of assessment. So your application would have to address them, and there's quite a few choices along the way. And you might be asking yourself, well, with all of that, where do I actually start? And I guess why Deb and Marcella have produced this roadmap is to more indicate that the application process and the permit process is at the end of your journey. Hopefully it's the last gateway you go through, and the support and why we've been engaged and why we're here today is to try to more front end this process. Give you as much advice to make the right decisions at the right time, so that when your application is actually lodged, it's been done with such degree of consultation with council and involvement with professionals that the assessment process that normally takes place for normal plan applications isn't what's occurring. It's more about a ticking box, that we've done all of the key questions, everything's compliant, and it can be moved through the process fairly quickly. So you would see that a lot of the discussion today is about your journey up to when you lodge your planning permit. It is about understanding your site, getting it right, engaging the right people. So you'll have plenty of choices and decisions to make along the way, and I imagine that's probably part of the stages that Rob was talking about. You can be, the number of decisions you have to make along the way can seem bewildering. Some points of advice I would make along the way is don't put the burden of being an expert on yourself. While this is your house and your property and you're the ones that are charged with moving it forward, you don't have to be the expert in all these areas. We sometimes assume that we have to because we want command of the situation and understand and make sure it goes right. But there is plenty of experienced professionals that can help you. I was talking to David about some building issues, and I said, I'm currently looking at rebuilding my house, and I'm a professional in this area, but I profess to not know stuff about the building process. And the risk I fall into is that I might have a bit of hubris and think I can do it myself, and make some mistakes along the way. And I'm telling myself, even as a planner of 25 years, to engage people that know what they're doing, because I know they can help me guide through the process. So look for people that know what they're doing. Don't take too much of that technical expertise. Now, you do still need to make the decisions along the way, but don't take on the responsibility of trying to be the geotech engineer or the planner or the arborist. I'd suggest one of the first things, if you really are going, where do I start? How do I get some momentum here? How do I keep going with this? The first thing I'd suggest is have a discussion with council. If you haven't done already, call them up, ask for a site meeting. The meetings that I had with Sarah and Fred on site, I thought were really helpful. Sometimes just standing on your property and talking through your thoughts, your ideas, the opportunities, is the impetus that you need. And that's often in that discussion the value can be, because you'll start to navigate where's next, and you're drawing upon that advice. There's plenty of people here to help you. I made that point. I did have a point here, but I think it's been well made by Rob and Kim. Keep an open mind. I think the comments that Rob made about what you've lost, and wanting to replace what's lost, can sometimes close your view of what are the potentials for your site. I fall into this trap as well. I said I'm looking at rebuilding, and I went to a building designer and said, I'm a town planner, I want this, can you draw me something up? And he challenged back on me and said, no, have you got that right? How about you look at this? And for a little bit I went, you tell me who, but I listened, and the outcome of what I'm going to be achieving from my site is improved because he challenged me with the benefit of his expertise on looking at something different. And I'm not in the position of having gone through the trauma that you guys have, and I understand it's a very different circumstance and where you're starting from. But do keep an open mind for those opportunities, because from my experience, most houses in the hills weren't built in the right site with the right sensitivities to northern orientation, to views, and to other sort of things. They're probably just plonked in, and there can be some really great opportunities to do something vastly better or creative if you just use the right advice. And importantly, it can really substantially improve your amenity and enjoyment of your property into the future. I'd advise getting accurate information about your site. I'm really hyped when I spoke to Fred and Sarah, both of them already onto survey plans for their site. A really accurate survey plan of your property is really helpful, because when you make that approach to an architect or to a building designer, they're working off very accurate information. The designs that they're looking at for your site can be responsive, and it actually gives you a very good visual understanding of what your property looks like. Planning, permits and plans can often fall apart or encounter problems where the information is not accurate, because there can be misunderstandings about the height of the retaining wall when it was supposed to be this high, and the plans show it as this high. And so accurate survey information. And if you don't know what a survey plan is, it's a surveyor draws an accurate contour map of your site that picks up all the features, the trees, the boundaries, the remnant parts of the retaining wall, the garden features and so on. So you know how much space that you've got working for you. And that information will be very important when you do approach your geotech engineer for an assessment, because they'll have to understand how the site's impacted, and also your arborist and all the other people. In relation to the site, a few general rules, tips. Generally try to use the same site and the same access if you can. Now, I say that with some caveats. I say it mainly because often you'll already have some benched in site, it's ready to go. There's less rework required to rebuild. And it can be a cost saving because you're not having to do additional earthworks, additional retaining walls, and you can make use. But the caveats to that is that some properties may have their house in a really bad location, or there is a much better location for your amenity, your outlook, response to landslip, or even just where you're going to put your septic system. So don't discount the potential of moving it. Just make sure that if you are looking at moving, that you're considering all the factors. But generally putting it on the same site has a lot of benefits because of alteration to the site. Try to avoid removal of native vegetation. Now, I know that may be a sensitive issue when it comes to trees and risk, and there is processes to sort of look at the trees. There will be need to assess whether trees can be retained close to or around what you're proposing to do. But the reason I say avoid it is that it can be native veg requirements that called in that can make the process a bit more complicated. Now, if your property is very altered and cleared and has no trees, there may not be any issues, but some properties may still have remnant native intact vegetation, and removing it just adds a level of complexity. Removing trees is also quite costly. I once dealt with a site in Mandarin where he wanted to remove 18 trees, and it's going to cost him $36,000. And he reassessed his assessment and kept most of them with a very sensitive design. But I fully appreciate the trees, given the issue, would need to be looked at in terms of their risk and safety. In terms of the process, my advice is that while you want to put your best efforts into front-ending it, engaging the right people, talking early, looking at the creativity, like most plans, they don't often go exactly to plan, and that you might need to plan or at least recognise that there may be unexpected issues along the way. Preparing a plan application is an assessment process. You are trying to synthesise some geotech information around what you can and can't do, trees, bushfire, and you've also got a design that you want to try to achieve. And sometimes those external factors like bushfire and push and pull the design around. So you need to be able to sort of expect that you may need to go back to your design, tweak and change things, or to improve them, and there might need to be some rework. Don't think of that as another blockage or that you'll be set back. It's just part of the process about evolving your design and what's being proposed. And you may need to revisit things multiple times. And finally, and this is coming from my own experience as a planner with my own rebuild, is don't try to conceptualise the whole process at once. You will do your head in. There is a lot to deal with. If you try to think about it from go to woe, you will get beset by the number of choices along the way and the complexity of the issues. Break it into small pieces. And I think what Rob said about having you're stuck in the mundane, you're treating water and having some longer term goals, break those goals up into bite-sized pieces, make them achievable, and so that you're getting that sense of progress. For me, part of sparking that joy around the potential was actually starting to put a plan down. I think we all look at the plans that Kim had up, and we start to visualise ourselves, could I live there, and that looks interesting, and that's modern and nice. Commencing that process and even just starting to think about it and putting it on paper can actually be a real rewarding part of starting that momentum. It doesn't have to be right. You don't have to get it right the first time. You might revisit it a number of times, but actually starting to visualise that is what can bring back the joy of putting aside. So